This is just to give a little kind of little preface. This is what should I say? A little exploration, as an attempt. This particular topic has been in discussion only for the last 15 years, particularly by one particular scholar from Kathmandu and from Kathmandu University. She has been spearheading, and I thought I'll pick up where she left off a little bit. And her name is Sadhanikaran, and one of the upcoming brilliant scholar from that part of the world. And she's exploring a very difficult subject. And this kind of also some of the thoughts I'm adding here, those later on, comes out from our last discussion in our doctoral dialogues, kind of we left off there. And so, looking at Sadhanikaran, and that is again a tentative attempt on my part kind of to say explorations of communication in Hindu philosophy. I intentionally avoided the word Indian philosophy because I want to make a distinction that India is a vast concept which includes other philosophies as well. So, but this one particularly comes out from Hindu philosophy. And so, first of all, just the terminology, Sadhanikaran simply means finding common ground. So that kind of lays the foundation how they understand, how it is understood in that context, communication. In other words, transcending phenomenon aimed at concord between message creator and expressionist, and the audience with the possibility of role reversal between the two on reaching emotion intelligence threshold. Now see, this is the kind of a big objective to accomplish. Same way where we could look at from our, if you want to use the term, Western communication understanding coming from the Latin root munus, care, munus meaning responsibility. So that the meaning would be responsibility to build, common responsibility. So communication is about responsibility to build. So it kind of comes out from also similar way of understanding it. So in the context of Sadhanikaran comes from the creation of exchange in soft and malleable information. So it's an expressive action, I should say, for bridging human beings at some level of understanding. So there's a constant effort on the part of the speaker or speakers engaged to make that everybody, the other parties involved are understanding, experiencing a similar state of mental acumen, common to that being experienced. So, and also it's understood that communication does not end, but it is an ongoing continuum. It's a continuum. It's always in motion. So what we find in communication here is convention. So what is the practices are prevailing, being creative, and of course aesthetics is very, very important in Sadhanikaran. In fact, Sadhanikaran, as I will kind of explore a little bit later on, comes from the field of drama, Natya. Comes from the field of drama. So now, and I'll explain a little bit later on what actually that entails, coming from the field of drama. So, in contrast to Sadhanikaran, they would say, and Adhikar is the author who kind of is spearheading this particular understanding of Hindu philosophy, Hindu communication in Hindu philosophy, is kind of points out Western communication focuses on surface structure, such as verbal language, body language, and non-verbal body language, non-verbal gestures, facial expressions, all those things become. And so, also, for example, see, the communication has been understood in the last 100 years or so, or maybe even 150 years, with the development of the Industrial Revolution, more and more in terms of commodities, as the commodification. How, as the technologies of communication became much more sharpened, improved, beginning with the, particularly with the telegraph, with the radio, and because all that was afterwards a way of how to monetize that. And when they began to be monetized, they began to say, okay, now how these words, what are the units? In Sadhanikaran, we would say the unit is a whole sentence. We would say the unit here is a word, every word, so you kind of count towards what words you choose, just to give you a little contrast there. So, whereas in the Hindu tradition, we would say, Hindu philosophy would say, Sadhanikaran comes from the deep structure, which features make a critical difference in our understanding of communication. the deep structure is shaped by the cultural and metaphysical assumptions about the definitions of truth and reality. It was interesting that the keynote speaker talked about, referring to Simone de Beauvoir, we talk about metaphysical malnutrition. We are kind of we are experiencing metaphysical malnutrition more and more, because we don't kind of talk about, look our world around that. So how do we understand the notion of truth and reality? The place of the individual in the universe is very, very important, cosmologists. And I don't think we are now paying attention to, particularly as one of the people, one of the person who asked the question about surveillance capitalism. In the relentless surveillance capitalism, what we find is there is no, it's all, our cosmologies have changed, and there is what is our universe? Our universe is particularly constructed now by the capitalistic system. So also in this particular model, Sadhanikaran, there is no contradiction between silence and speech, which is very strange probably for on this part of the Atlantic Ocean or in this part of the western part of the world. The silence and speech, there is no contradiction there, because silence keeps speaking, keeps talking. And so, putting in different words, Sadhanikaran means mutual understanding. So the effort is on part of the speaker and also on the part of the receiver of the information to make that genuine attempt and disposition to understand each other. You have to make this, because ultimately you have to find a commonness. You have to find that oneness among people. So that is the goal of communication. As I said in the beginning, we could also make similar argument from the Western model of communication, comunicare, responsibility to build, if you understand communication that way. So just to break down the words, Sadharan plus Nikaran. So Sadharan means mutual general presentation, simplification, universalization. So this concept is tied to another concept, and here I'm going to bring you. Now here, this is Adhikari's way of presenting this. It's a diagrammatic form of how all the components are involved in this. So I'm going to kind of unpack a little bit of these things here to give us a little bit of sense of understanding what is going on here. And I'll come back to that later, but I can give you a little preview, highlighted, so that we know what the terms are being used. In Latin we say tradutor is traditor, and the one who translates is a traitor. So translation is always difficult, and so there is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Immanuel Kant had a difficult controversy going on with another philosopher of his time, when they came across Bhagavad Gita was translated into German, and the other author was totally against translating Bhagavad Gita into German, because he says it is just impossible, the concepts are very, very different, you cannot translate that. So anyway, we'll come back to that. Okay. So, Sadhanikaran, I want you to become familiar with another interesting word. It's called Saridayas. Saridayas, and what does it mean? And they are the sender and receiver of the messages. So on both ends, that kind of thing. So this, the Sadhanikaran means, okay, so where am I? Here. Saridayata is the one, Saridayas, they are the ones who are, is a state of being in common orientation, commonality of oneness. Mm-hmm. And so one of the goals of Sadhanikaran is to attain this state of oneness. The state of oneness is Saharidayata, state of oneness. It illustrates how communication parties interact in the system to achieve this Saridayata. Everybody's goal is to say, okay, we need to be in a state of oneness, which is the state of common orientation, commonality, mutual understanding of oneness. Can you imagine this? If this were to happen, we wouldn't have wars, right? Everything would have been hunky-dory kind of world. So all communicating parties become saridayas, become the sharing the oneness, and that is the end of communication. So if you want to define, an adhikari would say that Sadhanikaran objective is the conversion of one's feeling and attaining of feeling of others. So after having this engagement, this conversation, finally at the end result becomes we share that feelings. Now how your feelings and my feelings, we kind of become one, and we are forming this oneness. Now also Sadhanikaran, as you can see, is not linear, and this particular diagrammatic that Adhikari kind of makes a strong point about it is that this is circular. It is not a linear. So communication in the Hindu context, in the philosophy context, is not linear, and so as I said earlier, Sadhanikaran is a generalization of feelings, ideas, emotions. Somehow you kind of mash them all. So I passingly mentioned that communication, Sadhanikaran, kind of is grounded in a play, in natya, in dance. Natya is the dance in the Sanskrit word for that. Natya Shastra, the knowledge, Shastra, knowledge, the knowledge of dancing. And also, Natya also can be understood. It's very interesting. Sanskrit is a very complex language. The meaning changes within in the context that you use it. Sometimes you'll find the word natya also translated and presented to us in English as justice. But in this context, it is about the dancing. The Sadhanikaran is the climax of drama when the audience becomes one with the actor. So think about it. The audience becomes one with the actor. The audience lives an experience through his or her acting on stage and starts simultaneously reliving the same experience. So that is kind of the ideal or idealistic way of looking at communication in this context. Sadhanikaran is a systematic presentation of a process of attaining mutual understanding, commonness or oneness among communication parties. I come back to this thing, want to just impress upon everyone this is the ultimate goal of it. So let me unpack these words now a little bit and kind of gives us a little insight what it means. First of all, it comes out from the poetic Sanskrit, not just Sanskrit, but the poetic Sanskrit. And I want to make that point because Sanskrit is a very complex language, and it takes years for people to master Sanskrit, and always it has been like that. And so but this concept, these concepts here, they come from the poetic Sanskrit. So you can imagine the elasticity around these concepts. So the Hindu and also is grounded into religious philosophical knowledge. So communication is necessarily in this context is religious, is spiritual. There's a spiritual context of that. And you can, as you can well know, the classic Hinduism, I use the word classic because now Hinduism is taking its own forms, unfortunately. But the classic Hinduism is necessarily a way of life. It's not a religion. It's a way of life. It has no founder. It's a philosophy that just came about because of the people came around. There's no founder like other religions have. So here is only one philosophy. I think, to my best knowledge, this is the only religion in the world that has no founder. So imagine now that. So it's a philosophy of life. This is how you live your life, and so it is. And this Sadhanikaran is ingrained in that part of way of living. So Saharidayas, sender and receiver. This one here. So Prishkaha would be the sender, Kapaka would be the receiver. So we take the turns, because when I speak and you respond, when I speak, I become the sender. When you respond, I become the receiver. So it comes always back and forth. Now, what happens here is there is an expectation that these Saharidayas, and this is again the spiritual component of communication here, is that these people, Saharidayas, must have those whose hearts are attuned to each other. Imagine that. so much of burden is being put. There is an enormous responsibility that I have to make an effort and you have to make an effort, that genuinely we are disposed to listen to the same thing. We're kind of talking about the same thing. So, another important thing here, which in our Western tradition we do pay attention to it, but we do not give as much attention as this particular model tries to give. And that is what is known as the bhava. And the bhava are the moods or emotions. The moods or emotions. And I'll talk a little more about that later on, different types of mood, different types of emotions that we have. And then another important part of that is abhivachana, expressing or encoding. See, when I want to say something, I need to find a word for it that would encode what I want to say in a proper way. And so oftentimes, for example, we'll say, okay, we are struggling for words because I don't know what I'm looking for. Because this is exactly, we may have a lot of words, we go through the various synonyms, and we'll probably go through our thesaurus in our head, but we want to choose a particular word because we think that particular word encodes exactly what, or at least more or less exactly what we're trying to say. And for them, in this particular context, it's very, very significant that we take time to find the right word. And that's where the Sanskrit, the wealth of Sanskrit knowledge, Sanskrit languages, gives that opportunity or that elasticity to find those words within the system. So, because they are very important, the emotions, the moods are very important, and they must be somehow encoded. And then afterwards you send the message, Sandesh. Sandesh today probably you've heard on the radios and all. Sandesh is a message, information. And Sarani is a channel, what channel you're using. Now here in this particular case, we are talking, our channel is simply verbal, but there is in between, there is what we'll call the doshas, that is the noise, some air conditioning coming through, some words not going properly, whatever. But here, there is a rasa swadhana. Rasa swadhana is very important and takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, I should say. And it's a receiving, decoding, and interpreting the message, and finally achieving the rasa. Now, rasa is a very interesting concept here. So it is. So I receive what you say, or you receive what I'm saying, and you are decoding it in your own way, and that decoding is subject to your own personal lived experience. You're subject to your own personal lived experience. So I may encode that in my lived experience and I pass it on, but you're decoding it based on your lived experience. And that's where misinterpretation, difficulty comes. So Sadhanikaran will say, we have to make an effort to internal disposition to really understand, is this where you're coming from? Is this what you're trying to say? And that's where talking about authenticity, this is where authenticity comes through. And so, and then afterwards you interpret. Now we do this in our daily conversations. Anytime we say something to someone, to our friends or whatever, we immediately add, do you know what I mean? That is a kind of effort of doing the rasa swadhana, to interpret the message. Is my message properly interpreted? And now, having interpreted properly, and both of us, we feel that the giver, the sender, and the receiver, kind of thing feel that way, then we say, okay, now we have achieved the rasa. Now rasa is an interesting concept here, and that is the literal meaning of the word rasa is Sanskrit word. Rasa means juice, something to delightful. It is tastes good. It is something to be experienced. So it's an aesthetic component to it. It's a feeling. You really feel that, okay, I can take it more now. I really enjoy this. So the enjoyment, rasa gives you the enjoyment that now we are on the same page. And as mentioned to you, there are those noises, the dosas. These are noises in between interruption that takes place. So, and then of course, we all know this, and I'm using our Western model from diagrammatic as well, Sandarbha, which is the context. Context is, we all know context is very important for everything. But again, they also would say context is important. And context in a way gives a life to the message. gives life to the message. And of course, like everything else, there is a feedback, and the feedback is here, pratikriya. Pratikriya is the feedback. Now, each one of these steps, in the Hindu philosophy tradition, in a classical Hindu philosophy, it does not happen in a rush. It is not to be resolved, or everybody has to come on the same page at the same time, in the shortest amount of period of time, because otherwise you lose money, otherwise you don't do the business, otherwise that expectation is not there, because this is a spiritual exercise. And so, I just want to reiterate again the significance of rasa, which is the essence of what both of us are trying to convey to each other, and we finally get that. And so that essence is and that's why it's called aesthetic flavor, and which is an essential element in any work of visual, literary, and performing art that can only be suggested and not described. That means only can be experienced. Okay, I experience it. Whichever way I've been trying to describe is always with short form. So, rasa theory asserts that entertainment, because it comes from the Natya side, the drama performance is expected to evoke joy, artistic joy. But that is not the primary goal here. Primary goal is instead to create parallel life in front of the audience, that we are both living in the same environment, where we understand each other, and experience a sense of one's own consciousness, spiritual or moral world. And so that is the classic understanding of communication here. Now, I'm going to unpack this a little bit here. These terms are again further unpacking, and you can see here the process that goes through, kind of constantly recycles itself. So, the word para, for example, okay. So, para is an unconscious mind. Now, this unconscious mind is the equivalent of in Hindu philosophy, God resides in your head. Not in Christian tradition, God resides in our heart, right? But in Hindu tradition, God resides in your head. That's why you don't touch people's head. If you touch, for example, police, when they arrest somebody here, what they do, they'll put head and put in the car, right? They don't do that in India. If you do that in India, it is blasphemy. It's not accepted. You don't touch. You touch the feet. You bow down at the feet, but not the head, because that is God's temple. God resides here. So that's why when the thought comes, thought is the equivalent of God. So my thought is as good as God is speaking, that kind of thing. So this para is the unconscious mind. Now this unconscious mind moves to conscious mind, partiality. It moves to conscious mind, and from the conscious mind. Okay, now this is interesting here. Madhyama. In the Madhyama now, what happens? There is an activity taking place. Now I'm appropriating in my own mind this meaning. So the God's Atman, the God's Brahman spoke, and now the thought is going through this mundane process, And so you have here the level of what is happening in the mind here now. That is also called internal conversation, internal discussion, internal dialogue. I have conversation with myself, and then having gone through that process, then I do this vaikari, and that is the word comes up, and the word says. Now here, what I said earlier, words are very important. Therefore, there is no difference between speech and silence. Even in silence, there is it speaks. Silence speaks very loud and clear. Message may not be understood immediately, but it gives you time to ponder, and then afterwards you may come a little later. So there is no, and as you also, and I probably have mentioned many times in my classes that Indians, like Italians, speak with a lot of with the language, with hands, but also with the head. There is always a complaint when somebody is asked something, we always do like this, says, why is that like this? And that is a serious understanding there. Why people don't do like this and don't do like this. I remember my own story. When I first arrived to the United States, that very evening I was at Kennedy Airport. I did not know where I was going. And there was a fellow who helped me to find my address where I was going. And he arranged me for something called limousine, which I never heard that word before until I arrived at the airport here. And he said, explain to me where to go, on how much, and he asked me at the end, did you understand? And in my typical fashion, I did this. And he said to me, he grabbed by my shoulder and he said to me, my son, he said, he was kind of a little grandfatherly fellow. My son, I remember those words, he says, you are in America now. We don't do like this. We say yes or we say no. That is my first intercultural communication lesson when I arrived here some 30-some years ago. So, and why is that? Why is that? That is a silence communication through silence. What does it say? It's simply, if you do like this or like this, it's an aggressive communication. It's an aggressive gesture. So you don't want to be aggressive to the other person. By not being aggressive, you kind of round your head. Did the other person understand? Yes, no, that is not necessary. But what is important is that you did not disrespect the other one by engaging into aggressive gesture, that aggressive communication. So now, remember we talked about those bhavas, the emotions. Here, those emotions play a very important role, as we can very well understand. And those emotions, somehow we have to make sure that they are shared, that I share my emotions with you. And only then we can find a common ground. And so the receiver, Saradaya, must pass through the process of Rasasvana. There are 4 ways of doing it. Shravana, now I'll explain to you what does it means. Okay, so
as the official taskmaster, I just want to keep us on time. Another 5-10 minutes
okay.
tops, okay?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much.
Sure.
So, sorry. Okay, let me fast forward a little bit here. We'll come back afterwards. You can ask me questions. Now, as in Natya Shastra, as I mentioned to you, that this whole theory comes through the dance theory. Bharata Muni, the author of this, emphasizes that total communication efforts includes the use of words as well as limbs. So you speak not only with the words, limbs, gestures, and body language along with the physical context in order to ensure communication at its best. So the best communication takes place when you have a whole natya taking place. So human being essentially is a bundle of bhavas, meaning bundle of emotions that constitute his or her being from part of his or her total consciousness. There are different types of bhavas. So let me clarify. Stehi bhavas, which are predominantly dominant, that is rati, which means love, hasa, which is merriment, shoka, sorrow, krodha, fury, uttasha, enthusiasm, bhaya, terror, juguspa, disgust, vismaya, astonishment. So these are kind of predominantly dominant. Usually we kind of respond right away to that, how we tend to feel. So then there is other one, which is vyavichari or sanchari bhavas, and these are come and go. They are not that, they don't make that kind of strong impression. They come and go. And then of course you have the sattvikam or sattvaha bhavas, which are originating in the mind, they're temperamental, so again, depending on personalities, those kind of things play there. So all the rasas must be manifested. Now here through sankita. Sankita means code. Now what is code? To put it in a very simple language, the way we understand, code is language. Now, these are, other words, the symbols that are organized. I want to emphasize that because otherwise, sometimes especially there's a trend nowadays to say, okay, this is my way of speaking, this is my way of writing, streams of consciousness, but I don't understand what you're writing. There is no, I wrote something, but this is my writing. Whether to respect the way I write, we have this interesting complication nowadays. So they must be organized according to specific rules, so that both sender and receiver must understand the code being used. So there has to be some kind of convention, that where you put the comma, where you put the period, where you put the semicolon, all those conventions are necessary so that people understand, and that's why then you have this sankita, there is good communication. So the process of encoding, avivajana, has been shown consisting of 4 stages, which I went through 3 with it. So at the end, I just want to highlight that communication in Indian philosophy or Hindu philosophy is necessarily a spiritual exercise. It is not a capitalistic, consumeristic opportunity. And that's where it gets abandoned. It becomes a nice, when I was writing this little exercise here, as a response, as a reaction to what Adhikari was writing, I happened to know her, made an effort to get to know her because I was interested in her writing. She's the only one who has been writing since 2005 on these different things. And I said, I want to see if anybody else is writing. There are a few others who are writing, but it may be about 4 or 5. But it is important to pay attention to this, even though it may not be very difficult to monetize. And if there is no monetizing possibility, somehow it gets pushed away. That's why you'll find in universities in India what type of communication we teach. It is the Western model, because they also bought into capitalism. They also are part of the industry. They're also part of these global financing. So effort to the globalization, financial globalization in many ways. So I hope there are a few questions. If you want to clarify, I'll try to clarify as much as I can. A little bit of an illustration what the other world is thinking about. And I wanted to talk about, because in our class, I teach this philosophy of communication for our doctoral students. We did Africa, Ubuntu, we did the other day, Arabian way of understanding communication. And I thought, we need to look at the Indian way of understanding communication, or Hindu way of understanding communication, just at least from a cultural point of reference. I don't know if we can do its use in terms of day-to-day functioning in the professions, but at least we are aware of it from a scholarly point of view, from educational point of view, as informed people. So.
Great, thank you. Thoughts, questions?
Yeah, please.
Thank you for the talk. Really interesting. Just curious, this idea of listening as being such an important component of this process, I guess. And it's also interesting to think about listening as an active activity, right? It's often thought of as something passive that we do and we just kind of absorb, right? So I guess I was just kind of curious if you could speak a little bit more about that idea of active listening. And
yes.
Maybe, and also too, just one other quick point, the idea of the rasa, about connecting active listening back to that idea of joy and delight and pleasure. Really curious to know more about that.
Yes, I've done quite a bit of reading, not only from a Hindu perspective, but also from Christian spirituality. One of my favorite spirituality guy is Saint Benedict, and he talks about listening with your heart. So, and the Benedictine spirituality emphasizes on listening with your heart. And so I come from my own personal way. I come from that kind of way of thinking. You listen with your heart, you give yourself full presence, and which is oftentimes very difficult because we have to multitask nowadays, more often than not. And so, but I think we need to make an effort, and I am a big believer in that, and I try to impress whoever is around me, because that's the only way we can be, in my own little world of academia, peace builders, that is subjects that I teach, so we don't have to do some major strategies, but listening, because the moment the other person realizes that I'm really paying attention to you, you are well disposed towards me. At least this guy listened to me. May not have agreed. So, I mean, you break the first barrier, and then afterwards it starts with that. And that has been, see, in Hindu traditions, and I'm not Hindu, so I lived among the Hindus in the Indian tradition. I come from the part of the world. I speak not Sanskrit, but I speak Hindi and kind of local languages. So I understand. The most important thing about Hinduism that I really feel that is kind of disappearing is the notion of Gurukul. The Gurukul is that's where the school where you learn to listen. You learn to listen, and the listening is the starting point of building relationships. That is something that is very building community. It's building community, building relationship is a very, very important understanding. But unfortunately, in the world of where we are all becoming caught up with the industrialization of the society and the fast world and rough world, nobody has time for it. Everybody wants to become quick, and time for listening is becoming not only less and less, but now we are kind of compelled to listen by multitasking. But I think I would like to say that we have to make an effort to give full total attention if we really if people matters to me. If the other matters to me, then I have to make that effort. And that's the only way. I hope it has been helpful.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
So I've often been criticized because I also use my hands, as you mentioned before. But I never really thought about that our use of parts of our body while we're listening is also a rule of conduct that at least you're respecting the other instead of saying something negative.
Yeah.
And so it's actually an empowering form of communicating, but without getting to a clash or disagreement. I think this is a fantastic way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Because we're actually trained of not using our hands or other expressions, and when you speak, you have to be.
I've taken my students to Italy years ago, and I was at Via Aurelia there. We were staying in that area, and I've taken students for a walk in the evening, and then one of the students began to talk to another Italian student, and Italian student I was watching from a distance, and the Italian students, were talking with their hands and everything, and we went back to where we were staying in Via Aurelia, and she came to me and she says, "Professor, they are so rude." I said, "What happened?" "Oh, they've been talking, they're doing like this and like this." I said, "Okay, let us sit down now." And I have to be the professor. I had to say, "Listen, you know what it means?" I explained to her the body language and the role of the body language. They are not being rude. I said, different cultures have different ways of speaking. We have high context cultures, low context cultures, so different ways. Even in Italy, you have go to south Rome and south of Rome, hands become very important part of communication, of conveying the message or shaping the message. Whereas you go up to Milan and further up north, they are a little more what do you call that, Germanic or more Teutonic, I should say. And they are not as flamboyant with their hands or whatever it may be. But these are cultural codes that we need to understand where we are, if you want to. But we just simply say, we in America, we do like this, therefore they don't do like that, therefore they're weird, So we can't do it. Yeah. So it's body language it's very important to understand how the role of body that plays in a role. During the pandemic, as the pandemic was going on, I wrote a little piece for a journal, for a magazine. I write my monthly articles for magazine in India. So about it was the time of the Easter time. That was not this time, last year. And in Latin we say "Noli me tangere," do not touch me, kind of thing. And okay, now you can't touch you during the pandemic. So what do you do? So the role of gazing, the gaze, the power of gaze, when you gaze somebody. So what we could do during the pandemic, we could talk, communicate through the gaze. And so I wanted to highlight the role of gaze in communication, how we gaze at others. And I think even the word gazing, to gaze, I don't know, may have developed a pejorative sense. oh, you're Googling me, they will say ogling me, like that. So, but it is, let's see how that kind of plays out, It's, we could not have our faith, we did not know too, so at least what do we do? How do we look at that? So.
Quick question?
Yeah.
I see parallels with 20th century linguistics and rhetoric, but I suspect this predates that, and I'm
Yeah.
curious how far back it goes.
Oh, see, it's interesting because the field of discipline of communication has been perennial debate for the longest time among scholars, and the field of communication is as old as humankind, because communication, the moment we were born, we open our mouth, right? The field is there. As a discipline of study, it is fairly recent. It's post-World War I and post-World War II. The big guys who laid the foundation of studying it in a systematic way is Shannon Weaver, when they published that famous book of Mathematics of Communication. And that is also because the pressure came down because of the technologies of radio, technologies of television were kind of coming along. And of course, at that time was how to monetize this. And so they were mathematicizing this. They were kind of units, okay, receiver, center, all those kind of things. So that model kind of prevailed. So even now, one of the things that Adhikari does, which I'm not terribly comfortable, and I did let her know about it, that what she's trying to make that model accessible to the rest of the world by using the Western Western structure, the very thing we criticize.
For example, like metaphysical, that sounds like Chomsky, that language is not in computation.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Okay, all right.
I mean, I really got a kick out of it.
So I was just curious when it was, because some of the, you know better than I, some of the ancient Vedic texts, Hindu philosophy, they, in terms of philosophy, medicine, and science, they predate Western society in many centuries. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, I was earlier. I attended another presentation about Aristotle and Acrasia. Notion of mental illness and how Aristotle described all these kind of things then, and then how we have understood the physiology and the biology, and kind of we're thinking of even the word mental illness. Whereas Aristotelian vision was we have one body, we have the spirit and soul and body, and that that metaphysics has kind of shifted away. And in that sense, I liked when she said there is a metaphysical malnutrition, and it just
we go from great intuitions to verified scientific data. Right?
Yeah.
That's the scope of it.
Yeah.
So Megan, you're all set. Thank you.
Thank you very much.